In today's video, I'm going to be covering the topic of water, and water is a really important component of life and in every living organism. So our bodies are made up of billions and trillions of cells, and 80% of the contents of our cells is water, and this helps provide the watery environment needed for constituents of the cell, such as the cytoplasm. And water has many important functions both inside and outside of the cell. So water is a metabolite in many metabolic reactions, and some examples that we've already covered are condensation and hydrolysis reactions. Water is also a solvent, and that means it can dissolve molecules into a solution, which is often needed for them to take part in metabolic reactions. So certain molecules will be dissolved in the cytoplasm where they can then go on and be used in these metabolic reactions. Water has what's known as a high latent heat of vaporization and a high specific heat capacity. We'll go over what those terms mean in just a minute, but this allows the water to be involved in controlling the temperature of living organisms. Water molecules are also very cohesive, and that means they stick together, and this allows them to be transported around in plants and other organisms. So let's have a look at the structure of a water molecule. Water has the molecular formula H2O, and this means it's made up of one oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms, and these are bonded together by covalent bonding, which means that their electrons are shared. Now, if we have a look on the right-hand side, I have drawn a diagram of a H2O molecule in terms of how the electrons are shared. So everything in green is a component of an oxygen atom, and everything in blue is a component of a hydrogen atom. Now, if we think about the basic structure of an atom, we know that in the centre of our atom, we've got our atomic core, essentially, and this is made up of protons, which are positively charged molecules, and neutrons, which have no overall charge. And surrounding this core, we've got electrons. Now, electrons exist in shells, and when atoms bond, they ideally want to have a full outer shell. Now, if we look in oxygen, we can see it's got these two rings surrounding it with electrons floating around the outside. So in our first shell, it can only hold two electrons. Now, water only has one shell and it only has one electron. So it will bond with another atom to share another electron, so that it's got this full outer shell of two electrons. Now, oxygen has got 6 electrons in its outer shell, so ideally it wants to bond with two other atoms or one other atom and share to gain 2 electrons in its outer shell, so that it has a full outer shell of 8, because our second shell is able to hold up to 8 electrons. So what will happen is that the hydrogen atoms will come along and they will share their electron in their outer shell, their one electron, with oxygen, and in turn oxygen will share an electron with hydrogen. So hydrogen ends up with 2 electrons in its outer shell, and oxygen ends up with 8 electrons in its outer shell, and this gives water a very stable configuration because all the atoms involved now have a full outer shell. Now, the negative electrons on the hydrogen atom are attracted towards the oxygen atom, and this is because there are more protons in the centre of the oxygen atom, so it exhibits a larger positive charge, and it pulls these electrons ever so slightly away from the centre of the hydrogen atom and ever so slightly towards the centre of this oxygen atom, and this gives hydrogen a slight positive charge because the electrons are being pulled away from it. Now, oxygen, because only 2 of its electrons are shared and involved in this covalent bonding, it still has 4 electrons in its outer shell that are just floating around and, and not involved in any sort of reaction, and this gives oxygen a slight negative charge. And because of these partial charges, water is what's known as a polar molecule. And because of this polarity, the oxygen atoms in one water molecule can attract hydrogen atoms in other water molecules. And this is because oxygen exhibits a slight negative charge and therefore is attracted to the slight positive charge on hydrogen atoms. And this attraction causes something called hydrogen bonding to occur, and this gives water a lot of its really useful properties. So as you can see, the diagram on the bottom of the screen, once again, oxygen is represented by green circles and hydrogen is represented by blue circles. And you can see I've drawn 3 water molecules here, and this is showing their hydrogen bonding. Now, I've got these funny little symbols by each atom, this delta symbol and either a plus or a minus. What this represents, the delta just represents that the charge is just a partial charge rather than a full charge. So we can see that hydrogen is delta positive because it's got this slight positive charge, and oxygen is delta negative because it's got this slight negative charge. Now, if you have a look at the leftmost water molecule, we can see that from the hydrogen atoms, we've got these dashed lines coming out, and they are joined to the oxygen atoms in the water molecule on the right. And this dashed line represents a hydrogen bond. And what a hydrogen bond is, it's a bond that occurs because the slight positivity of hydrogen atoms is attracted to lone pairs of electrons on other atoms. Now, hydrogen bonding does not exclusively occur with oxygen. It can also occur with nitrogen and fluorine. And it's just the positive charge from the hydrogen being attracted to a lone pair of electrons, because electrons are negative, so it's just this positive and negative attraction. Now let's go on and have a look at some of the properties of water. Water is a really important metabolite. We've established this point already, but many metabolic reactions will involve either a condensation or a hydrolysis reaction. Now, if we think back to some of our earlier videos and our earlier topics, we should already know that a hydrolysis reaction means hydro and lysis, or splitting with water, and this is where a molecule of water is required to break a bond. And conversely, we've got condensation reactions, which is where a molecule of water is released when a bond is formed. Another property of water is its high latent heat of vaporization. So there's lots of energy that's needed to break the hydrogen bonds between water molecules. And this means that for water to evaporate or vaporize, a lot of energy is needed for this process to occur. So many organisms will use water loss through evaporation as a way to cool down without losing an excessive amount of water. So if you think about when you exercise, when people exercise, they tend to get quite hot and sweaty. And this is because when you exercise, you have this sudden need for a lot more energy. So there's a lot of metabolic reactions occurring to provide you with this energy. But one side product or byproduct is this heat that occurs from these reactions. And obviously, our body wants to maintain a constant internal temperature of 37 degrees. So all this extra heat is being produced as a byproduct of reactions. And this is detected by the hypothalamus in the brain. And the hypothalamus will then send signals to the nervous system to activate certain mechanisms that allow you to cool down so you don't get too hot. So one of these mechanisms is something called vasodilation, which is where blood vessels nearer the skin will dilate or they'll get bigger. And this allows the blood to flow through more rapidly, and the heat or the excess heat in the blood will then be transferred to the surrounding air, allowing you to cool down. And another thing that will happen is that your sweat glands will be activated and they will secrete sweat. And then this sweat obviously then needs to evaporate off your skin. And to do this, it will take some of the heat energy from your body to allow the water to evaporate, and this allows you to cool down by getting rid of this excess heat. This can also be a major problem in people that have the inability to sweat. Now, this can occur because of certain skin conditions such as ichthyosis, where the skin gets very thick and you're unable to sweat. And it can also occur sometimes in paralysis. People lose their ability to sweat, and this can be very dangerous for people's health. And this is because, obviously, if you do any form of exercise or get too hot, you are unable to sweat and lose this heat through the evaporation of your sweat off your skin. And it can also be a really big problem when people get fevers. They're unable to sweat and they're unable to lose this heat, so their internal body temperature rises, and this can cause you to die if it gets too high. So another property of water is that it can buffer changes in its own temperature. And this is because the hydrogen bonds in water are able to absorb a lot of energy. So water has something known as a very high specific heat capacity, and this means it requires a lot of energy to heat water up. Now, if you think about this in a real life sense, if you think about a swimming pool or the ocean, they tend to remain at a pretty consistent temperature throughout the years. I mean, it may go up a few degrees, or it may reduce a few degrees, but really there's no drastic changes in temperature. And that's because, yes, it's also a large body of water, but it's because when the heat energy from the sun is absorbed by this water, the hydrogen bonds are able to absorb a lot of this energy, and water actually remains at a pretty consistent temperature. So if you have a really glorious sunny day in April or May, you may go in the sea, but it will be really cold, and that's because it's just been winter time. There's been a lot less sunlight, so water actually may have dropped a few degrees because some of this heat may have escaped into the environment. But actually, if you go in the sea at maybe, say, the end of September, when we've had a whole summer of sun on it, it will be slightly warmer because water's had all this time to take the heat energy from the sun, and it's stored in the hydrogen bonds, but it's not dramatically warmer. It may be a few degrees warmer, but it won't ever be drastically warm, and it will obviously be a lot colder than the surrounding air temperature. And this is really useful because watery habitats won't experience any sort of rapid temperature changes, and this creates a really stable environment for organisms within that habitat. So if you think about a lake, there can be a lot of marine life in there, so things like fish and small mammals, various water birds and amphibians. And even if you get a really dramatically warm period, the water will stay at a relatively similar temperature. And this is really good, especially for organisms like fish and other animals that aren't able to leave a watery habitat. If you think about if water didn't have this high specific heat capacity, you could get one very hot day, maybe say 40 degrees, and the water would instantly heat up. And all the animals that aren't able to leave the water would then die because the temperature would be just too hot for them to survive in. And this high specific heat capacity also means that the water inside organisms doesn't rapidly change its temperature either, and this helps us to maintain a constant internal body temperature of 37 degrees. Water also exhibits a really strong cohesion between water molecules, and cohesion is attraction between molecules of the same type. So water molecules are cohesive because they're attracted to other water molecules. And this is because of their polarity, and it causes them to stick together. So because of the slight negative and slight positive charges and this hydrogen bonding occurring between water, the water molecules, they aren't stuck together, but they are bonded by these hydrogen bonds, and so one big cohesive unit essentially. And this cohesion allows water to flow and transport substances. And the example I've given here is water travelling up xylem in plants. Now, we will cover more about plant transport later in a later video, but xylem is essentially a tube that allows the flow of water through plants. And when you water a plant, the water goes into the soil and it's taken up by the roots of the plant, and it has to be transported all over the plant. So this water has to flow upwards and against gravity, and it's the cohesion of the water molecules that allows this to occur. And a really good way to show this and to show the flow through water, it may have been an experiment you did in secondary school, but if you get a beaker of water and add some food dye to that water and then put a stalk of celery in it. Celery is a plant that is an excellent example of letting you see where the xylem and the phloem tubes are. So if you put your celery stalk in the beaker of water and leave it, after a few days you will see that there will be these tube-like structures in the celery that have taken up the colour of the food dye, and this is because the water has flown up through the xylem, and because the water is coloured you can see exactly where it's gone. So that's quite a cool at-home experiment that you can do to see this. And strong cohesion gives water a high surface tension when it comes into contact with air, and this is why sweat forms droplets on the skin, which obviously then evaporates and cools the organism. Now again, another really cool experiment you can do to show this high surface tension is if you get a coin, a 1 or a 2 pence coin, and you get a pipette with water in, you can put water on the surface of the coin drop by drop. Now, because of this cohesion, rather than forming a flat layer of water and then flowing off the coin, the water will almost form this dome-like structure, almost like a little snow globe. And it's because the water molecules with each drop can stick, and they're cohesive and they stick together and they form this dome-like structure. Now, eventually, if you keep adding drops and drops, the mass of the water, the base of the coin will not be able to support the mass of the water because the water can't keep sticking and forming an upward structure. Eventually it will have to flow outwards, and when the mass gets too much, then the dome will break and it will spill off the coin. But that's another really cool experiment to try. I remember we did that in a chemistry class, and I think the record someone got was 31 drops of water on the coin before the dome broke. But this high surface tension allows certain insects to be able to almost float on water. So the example I've given here, you can see in the bottom right hand side of the screen, is a pond skater, and pond skaters look like they're walking on water, and this is in part to do with water's high surface tension. So pond skaters have an adaptation where they've got these very sensitive hairs on their legs which allow them to detect the movement and the rippling of water. So they do have that adaptation which helps them to walk on water, but pond skaters are also very, very light insects, and their legs allow their mass to be spread over multiple points of contact. And because they're so light, and because water has this strong tension, they're able to walk on top of the water without breaking it because of this cohesion and the high surface tension. So the final property of water we're going to look at is water as a solvent. And many metabolic substances involved in our metabolic reactions are what's known as ionic, which means they contain one positively charged and one negatively charged ion. So an ion is just an atom that does not have an overall neutral charge. So it might have lost an electron and so now has a slightly positive charge, or it may have it may have gained an electron and therefore has this slight negative charge. And water, as we've already said, is a polar molecule. So the delta positive end, or the hydrogen atoms which have this slight positive charge, are attracted to negative ions. in ionic substances, and the delta negative end, so our slightly negative oxygen atoms, are attracted to the positive ions. And this means that when you put an ionic substance into a watery solution, the ions will be surrounded by water molecules, and this allows them to separate out and dissolve. So if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, I've got some examples of how water would surround these molecules. So here we can see in our sort of peachy orange colour, we've got a positive ion. Now, the oxygen atoms with their slight negative charge are attracted to this positive ion, and so they will surround it, and you get this almost hexagonal looking structure. So the oxygen atoms in the water will point inwards towards the positive ion, and the hydrogen atoms will point towards the outside. And if we look at the same thing with a negative ion, again, this time the slight positive charge on our hydrogen atoms are attracted to the negative ion, so they will surround it and form this almost triangular looking structure. So let's recap everything that we've learned today. We've learned that water comprises approximately 80% of a cell's contents. We know that water is made up of 1 oxygen and 2 hydrogen atoms, which have a slight negative charge and a slight positive charge respectively. So we know that when, because of the electrons and the way they're shared, we know that hydrogen's electrons are pulled slightly towards the centre of our oxygen atom, meaning hydrogen gets a slight positive charge, and because oxygen has its unpaired or unshared electrons, it's got this slight negative charge. We know that water is a polar molecule, and this gives it many of its properties, such as being a metabolite in many metabolic reactions, having a high latent heat of vaporization, having a high specific heat capacity, this strong cohesion that exists between molecules, and being a good solvent. So now that we've covered this topic, the best thing to do is to go back, make sure you fully understand and can comprehend the topic, and then to answer these following test questions. Number 1. What is the structure of a water molecule? Describe and draw a diagram showing the electron sharing between atoms. Number 2. Give 3 properties of water and explain why they are useful to living organisms. Number 3. How and why does hydrogen bonding occur between water molecules? Number 4. Describe how both a positive ion and a negative ion are dissolved in water. That's all for today. Thank you for listening.